Well, here I am. I'm back, and I'm on the road to recovery and feeling better with each passing day. And thanks to the providence of God, and God certainly does work in mysterious ways, I have a lot more time these days to work on these YouTube videos, something that I have not had time to do for many months, and it's something that's been bothering me. And so today we are going to move on in our study in the book of Revelation. And I want to recommend those of you who have been following this study that you might want to drop back at a certain point and watch the previous session or two to kind of get a refresher of where we were last and where we're going today and moving forward from here. However, I am going to start with a review of part of the structure of the book and how the events of Revelation unfold along a chronological timeline. So I'm glad you're with me, and let's jump right back into it. So, in review, you'll remember that I said at the very beginning that the book of Revelation basically breaks down into these three sections. The first section, covering from Revelation chapter 1, verses 1 to 20, is the vision of the glorified Son of Man that was given to the Apostle John, walking in the midst of the seven golden lampstands, the seven stars in his right hand, and the description of the glorified Savior, and what all that looked like and what the symbology was behind that. And then the second section, which we covered, was the things which are, covering Revelations chapter 2, verse 1 to 3, chapter 22. And those are, that section is representative, or are messages that are targeted to the seven churches of Asia Minor as representatives of, they were literal churches, but they were also representative of the structure of the movement of the church throughout this dispensation, the dispensation of the church age. And we looked at all of those, but also they are representative of different types of churches that you would find on the earth at any given time throughout this period of history, of this period of the church age. And so to kind of help us understand this, we would find ourselves in this present time in which we are living during the age of Laodicea. So it would be the very last period of the church age before there is an interval, and then on into the 7-year tribulation period, which is covered in Revelation chapter 4, verse 1 to the end of the book. And the end of the book there also talks about the millennial reign of Christ and the final judgment, the final rebellion and the final judgment. So we'll get to all of those, but we are dealing primarily now with the 7-year tribulation. So the structure and sequence of chapters 4 to 22, we have a vision of the throne room where the Lamb comes up and receives the scroll out of the hand of the Father in Revelation 4 and 5. And then we have the seven sealed judgments beginning in Revelation chapter 6, verse 1, which we will begin today. Today we're going to cover the first 4 seals. And then with the opening of the 7th seal, we have the onset of the 7 trumpet judgments. And then finally, with the sounding of the 7th trumpet, the 7 bowl judgments begin and are unleashed upon the earth. Okay, so many people fall into confusion when they're studying the book of Revelation, because they have a tendency, as I did for many years, to read the book of Revelation as a chronological sequence from beginning to back. That is, that it would follow a strict chronological sequence, but that is not the way to understand the book of Revelation. So as we begin today to look at the seven seals, it's important to understand that the seven seals, these judgments, what they are a brief overview of the entire 7-year tribulation period. So the way that breaks down is the first half of the tribulation is covered in chapters 6 to 9. In Revelation chapter 10, it forms a bookend into mid-tribulation. So it's kind of like the book of Revelation beams in here and takes a very close look at the mid-tribulation period. Lots of big things are happening there. And in that mid-tribulation period, you have Revelations 11, 12, 13, and 14. And those are to be considered as occurring simultaneously, not sequentially. Then Revelation 15 acts as a bookend to take us out of mid-tribulation period and into the second half of the Great Tribulation. So in the first half of the tribulation, in Revelations chapter 6 to 9, you have these things going on. You have the temple sacrifices and the worship resume. And you have the ministry of the 144,000 Jewish evangelists and the two witnesses, although you don't hear about this until later on, subsequent to Revelations chapter 6. Then in the second half of the tribulation, you have the bowl judgments poured out, and finally, the second coming of our Lord and Savior. So as we move on to the scroll, in the last session, I talked about the description here of the scroll that is sealed with 7 seals, and how it was customary to seal a legal document, and that seal had to be affixed by an authorized magistrate, one who had the civil authority to do so. And that on those documents there was writing on the inside, which would be detailing the terms of the agreement. And on the outside of the scroll, you would have a summary, a very brief summary of what was written on the inside. And this was very common with land deeds. And the summary was written on the outside of the seal, of the scroll, because to break the seal would be to void the contents of the deed. It would then have to be re-inspected, recertified, and resealed by another magistrate. And so what this scroll represents is the land deed to the land promises that were given to Abraham and his descendants. And as a result of their disobedience, the people lost, they never lost ownership of the land, but they lost possession of the land, and it was given over to the Gentiles. And so it is referred to by our Lord in Luke chapter 21, verse 24, where we read, "And they will fall by the edge of the sword and be led away captive to all nations, and Jerusalem will be trampled by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled." And so this tells us 3 things: is that the Jewish people would come under military conquest and attack. They would be dispossessed of the land, and they would be led away captive. They would be conquered as a nation, and that Jerusalem would remain primarily under Gentile control until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. One thing to note about studying the book of Revelation is it presupposes that you have a good understanding of the Old Testament texts that are directly referenced in this book. The book of Daniel, the book of Jeremiah, and the book of Zechariah, Joel, so on and so forth. But in any case, the times of the Gentiles spans the time period from the Babylonian conquest, I think that's about 586, 587 BC, until the second coming of Christ. So we see in Revelation chapter 6, verse 1, the execution of the deed The terms of it begin in Revelation 6:1. We read, "Now I saw when the Lamb opened one of the seals, and I heard one of the four living creatures saying with a loud voice, like thunder, 'Come and see.'" Now, it's important to drill down a little bit and to look at the underlying Greek words, because Greek is a declined language, and so it's more precise than our English language. So the word "to come" here is actually expresses itself along the lines of to follow a progress or trajectory. To give you an example of how this word is used in another passage in Scripture, we read in Matthew chapter 2, verse 9, "When they heard the king, they departed, and behold, the star which they had seen in the east went before them till it came and stood over where the young child was." And so you see here that the word is used within the context of a progress, a timeline, a trajectory of events. And so that it's important to understand that in order to understand what this living creature was saying to the Apostle John. Then we have the word "to see." So he was told to come and see, which is to observe and to take note, both with the vision and with the mind, because he was to record this and communicate it to believers from that time forward. And so John is being commanded by the living creature to both follow and discern the trajectory of the vision that follows. So John is a witness to the events from a heaven perspective, and you see this throughout the book of Revelation, where the progress of the narrative, where the progress of the chapters, they move in and out. They move from a temporal realm that is an earth-based realm into an eternal realm, and then back. And so John is witness to these events from a heavenly or eternal perspective. But what he sees in a vision happening in heaven will take place on the earth. And so there's an interesting way to consider that while John in a vision was in heaven receiving this revelation, he was seeing it actually taking place in the temporal realm. So the opening of the first four seals will each result in the appearing of a different horse, each having different colors and each having different effects. The fact that their respective colors represent something that they do is evidenced by their effect upon the earth. And so the colors of these horses, they all mean something, and they mean something in relationship to what is going to be taking place on the earth during this time period. And so let's move into the first seal. And the first seal speaks of the arrival of the Antichrist on the world stage. And so we read in Revelation chapter 6, verse 2, "And I looked, and behold, a white horse. He who sat on it had a bow, and a crown was given to him, and he went out conquering and to conquer." And so the symbology here is rich. The white horse is usually a horse that is ridden by military commanders or conquering leaders. And so it's clear here that this rider that is only referred to as he here and in subsequent verses is engaged in a military conquest or engaged in political conquest. And so we see by now, referencing a passage out of the book of Daniel, that this is in fact borne out by Old Testament prophecy, where we read in Daniel chapter 7, verse 24, "The 10 horns are 10 kings, who shall arise from this kingdom, and another shall arise after them. He shall be different from the first ones, and he shall subdue, pacify, or put down 3 kings." Now, we'll get into these 10 horns and the 10 kings, later on as we move through the book. But suffice it to say, for now, we can see that there is a political and military campaign that the Antichrist is engaged upon, that will involve the subjugation of three kings or three rulers. But as I mentioned just a minute or so ago, the writer is named here only as a he. He's only given the personal pronoun. And we see the very same thing also in the book of Daniel, where we read in Daniel chapter 9, verse 27, and he shall confirm a covenant with many for 1 week. But in the middle of the week he shall bring an end to sacrifice and offering, and on the wing of abominations shall be one who makes desolate, even until the consummation which is determined is poured out. And so when we read he here in these verses in Revelation chapter 6, remember I said that Revelation presupposes that you're familiar, most especially with the prophecies in Daniel chapter 10, that he is a cue, and it's a clue that it's referring to the same he in the Daniel passages. Okay, moving on. Verse 2, we read, and I looked, and behold, a white horse, and he who sat on it had a bow, and a crown was given to him, and he went out conquering and to conquer. It's interesting to note here that the vision, the image, shows the Antichrist carrying a bow, but no quiver and no arrows. And that will kind of be the equivalent of a gun with no bullets. So you can have a gun and not have bullets in it, and it's still a very threatening weapon, and it's still a very intimidating weapon. And so what this seems to be saying here, by the image of the bow, the Antichrist carrying a bow but no arrows, was that his initial program of conquest involves intimidation through the potential for violence, that he's certainly capable of it and certainly will if he's forced to. Then we are told that he has a crown. The Greek word here is Stephanos, a crown that is received in recognition of achievements. So in Daniel, we are told that the 11th king is different from the 10 kings, and that he comes to power by subduing 3 of the original kings. This suggests that he will be a man either of military or political power, and again we have the confirmation of the white horse that says the same thing. That phrase, conquering and to conquer, is interesting. It implies that he goes out into the world overall, and that the process is not instantaneous, but progresses toward that goal over a period of time. So his rise to power begins very slow and subtly by employing intrigue, intimidation, and then finally going to military power and military might. We see this also confirmed in the book of Daniel in the 11th chapter. We read, at the time of the end, the king of the south shall attack the king of the north, and the king of the north shall come against him. See, there's the personal pronoun again, like a whirlwind with chariots, horsemen, and with many ships. And he, personal pronoun, Antichrist, shall enter the countries, overwhelm them, and pass through. So there it is. Which now, as we move from his trajectory of conquest from intrigue to intimidation, finally to military might, it naturally moves us into the events of the second seal. And he opened the second seal. I heard a second creature saying, come and see. Another horse, fiery red, went out, and it was granted to the one who sat on it to take peace from the earth, and that people should kill one another. And there was given to him a great sword. And so the red horse here symbolizes obviously bloodshed. But it's important to note that the person sitting on this horse is the same as the one seated on the white horse, that is the Antichrist. His rise to power, while initially began through political intrigue and intimidation, now moves to open warfare against those who oppose his rise to power, and we are moving into World War 3. On a note that is relevant to this, we will see that as the judgments and as we progress through the book of Revelation, as a result of all of the different judgments, all of the different wars that God is visiting upon the earth in judgment, that the habitable environment of the earth shrinks continually until it seems like the only place left on planet Earth that is habitable is just that region around the Fertile Crescent, the Mesopotamian Valley. It's as if through this process of judgments and devastation, God is driving the Gentiles to that place that we know is Armageddon, where God will sit in judgment, where Christ will return and sit in judgment on the Gentile nations for the way that they have abused and oppressed God's people Israel and blasphemed his holy name throughout the millennia. Anyway, and so we find ourselves, he brings about World War III, which naturally leads to the third seal. We read in Revelation 6, 5, and 6. When he opened the third seal, I heard the third living creature say, "Come and see." So I looked, and behold, a black horse, and he who sat on it had a pair of scales in his hands. And I heard a voice in the midst of the four living creatures say, "A quart of wheat for a denarius, and 3 quarts of barley for a denarius, and do not harm the oil and the wheat." Notice here again, I want to keep pointing this out. The continuing use of the same pronoun in reference to the rider indicates that it is the same person riding these 3 horses. And the scales here that he is carrying do not represent the scales of justice, but a measure of monetary value. So these scales were vital to commerce in the ancient world, especially when calibrating the value of coins, because there was a scheme by which coins, which typically were either gold or silver, were shaved. And so you would shave a coin, and as a result of shaving that coin, it would lose value. And so these scales were important. So these coins all had a fixed set weight, and so they would be placed in the scale along with the fixed weight to make sure that the coins had not been shaved and that their value was what they were supposed to be. Anyway, so as a result of World War, global commerce and the supply chain is disrupted and hyperinflation sets in. I think this is a term that we can all relate to now as a result of the pandemic or mismanagement, or however you want to, whichever doorstep you want to lay this at. We see now, even in our time, what the disruption of the supply chain brings about. It brings about inflation. And so we're living during a time of inflation that we have not seen since the 70s and 80s. Anyway, be that as it may, can you imagine how bad it will be during World War III? And not only is the supply chain disrupted, but a great deal of what is consumable, food, equipment, electronics, so on and so forth, is diverted to the war effort, and so which makes the lack even greater. Anyway, in John's day, the average laborer earned about 1 denarius a day. Now, 1 denarius at that time had the purchasing power of 12 quarts of wheat or 36 quarts of barley. 1 quart of wheat, now mind you, was enough to make 1.5 loaves of bread, or 1 denarius worth of wheat could make 18 loaves of bread, which would be enough for an average family at subsistence level for almost 2 weeks. So a family could live at subsistence level for almost 2 weeks on 1 denarius worth of purchasing power. So if we were to take that now and recalibrate it into our time, so one denarius a day would equal approximately $80 a day uh, for the common wage laborer. Now, this number I think is a little bit low because I think it's based upon a $10 an hour minimum wage. But be that as it may, at that level, one loaf of bread in today's currency value would cost $60. So imagine paying $60 for a loaf of bread. That's going to be the reality, if you can even get it, during this time period as a result of the Antichrist's quest and thirst for power and control. So as a result, we'll see panic, rampant crime, looting, and starvation. And so we're kind of seeing several of those things in our time now. We're seeing rampant crime. We're certainly seeing looting. People are panicking, worrying about what's coming next. But there's an interesting these verses are closed with this interesting phrase, which says, "Do not harm the oil and the wine." Now, I think this is relevant, and I think it's relevant for this reason, that the chief crops in Israel are olives and grapes. And so what I believe that this is saying is that while the rest of the world is experiencing these supply chain disruptions and this economic degradation, that Israel will be divinely preserved so that the the crops will still be brought in. And as we get later down the line in the chapters, we'll see how agriculture and all of those things are devastated as a result of the judgments that come as a result of the trumpet judgments and the bowl judgments. But Israel will be divinely protected. And so the oil and the wine, I believe, is a reference to Israel, that they will be relatively preserved unscathed during this time period. Okay, and finally the fourth seal in Revelation 6, 7, and 8. When he opened the fourth seal, I heard the voice of the fourth living creature saying, "Come and see." And I looked, and behold, a pale horse, and the name of him who sat on it was Death, and Hades followed with him, and power was given to them over a fourth of the earth, to kill with the sword, with hunger, with death, and by the beasts of the earth. And so notice here now it's still the same rider referenced by the personal pronoun, but now there are two terms equated with him, the Antichrist, death and Hades. Now death is a condition and Hades is a destination. So he brings about death, and he also brings about a sweeping of a multitude of people into Hades, or commonly we refer to it as hell. The pale horse, it's actually the Greek word is chloros, which literally translated as green, represents the color of a body many hours after death. And so this color on this horse represents the stench and rot of many bodies left unburied. And so as a result of war, as a result of the hunger, the death, and the pestilence that come afterwards, there will be so many bodies littering the earth that it will not be possible to bury them. As a matter of fact, there is an interval at the end of the book of Revelation where time is allowed for the land to be cleansed, where buriers will go out among the land and look for unburied corpses and bury them. So it's important to understand now that throughout all of this, God is executing the terms of the deed to take possession, to retake possession of the land for his people. And this is how he's dealing with it and entering into judgment with the Gentiles of the world. So while the Antichrist is perpetrating all of these things, and he's doing so under the control of Satan and under his own depravity and wickedness, we have to see that God is bigger than all of this, and he's using he's using the wickedness of Satan and the Antichrist. Later on in the book of Revelation, they become one as Satan indwells the Antichrist. But they are all operating under the power and authority of God. And so God is using their wickedness to bring about his plan, which is repossession of the land and judgment of the Gentile nations during this 7-year period. So it's important to keep in mind this aspect of it, that the function of the Antichrist during this phase is to sweep across the earth. And as he gains power and millions die, those who are unbelievers are swept into Hades to await the great white throne judgment. And so he's used as an instrument by God to sweep unbelievers off of the world. Those who had rejected his son as Messiah are now swept off of the earth into Sheol, into that place somewhere beneath the surface of the earth, and they're held captive there to be raised and to be brought before the judgment, the great white throne judgment, which we will get to at the very end of the book. Be that as it may, because of the devastation of the environment, it's also important to remember, and nature's food supply, that animal-human predation will increase exponentially. And so prey, our animals, not having a food source, will turn to humans as a food source. And so at this point, by this point, 1/4 of the world's population has perished. Now, it's important to remember a couple things. One, remember, as I said, that the 7 seal judgments is a brief description of the entire 7-year tribulation period. And so the events that we're talking about here, the events that we've talked about thus far, stretch out over a period of 7 years. And when we get to the 7th seal, we'll see the 7th seal opens up the first trumpet judgment. And so the trumpet judgments are included in that seal, that sealed scroll that is sealed with 7 seals. And as we get to the 7th trumpet judgment, we have in the 7th trumpet judgment the 7 bowl judgments. So if you can picture sort of a Russian nested doll, this is kind of like what we're dealing with here. And so it's important to keep that in mind. Anyway, Christ as the Redeemer has overcome and is the only rightful heir to the land promised to Abraham and his descendants. He is the promised seed. He is the one. Only he is worthy to open the scroll, to loose its seals, not seas, and thus begin the process of executing the terms of the deed. Upon their failure to uphold the requirements of the national covenant, and it's important to keep this in mind, that the covenant that was made between God and the Jews at Mount Sinai was a national covenant. It was not an individual covenant. If you were to go back and look at those passages, that when they agreed to the covenant, they agreed to the covenant not only for themselves, but all of the descendants who would follow from them. Now, when I say it's a national covenant, it means this, that if any individual within that nation with whom that covenant was made violated so much as one precept of those 613 commandments, then the whole nation would come under the guilt of that violation. So naturally, there was a failure there. So upon their failure to uphold the requirements of the national covenant, the possession of the land was turned over to the Gentiles. The Jews have never lost possession of that land. It is their land in perpetuity. However, they didn't lose ownership of the land. It's their land in perpetuity. However, they did lose possession of the land as a result of violating the agreement or the covenant of Sinai. So the possession of land was turned over to the Gentiles until the time of the Gentiles comes to its conclusion, which comes to its conclusion at the end of the Great Tribulation or at the end of 7 years. So the Lamb opens the scroll and looses its seals, which begins the process of reclaiming possession of the land in fulfillment of God's promise to Abraham and his physical descendants. A big part of that reclamation program involves God's judgment upon an unbelieving world. And so I want to close out this session with this stark reality that we already see very clearly here, that billions will die during this time period. The surface of the earth will be devastated. Life will be different. And billions will die. And all unbelievers will be swept into Hades to await the final judgment. But you know what? It's not only unbelievers who will die during this time period. Believers will also perish and die during this period, but they will be ushered into the presence of God to await the resurrection. So here we are. We all have a decision and a choice to make. And so I want to close this by asking you, if you could choose, which group would you choose to be? Would you choose to join? Would you choose to be part of the group that gets swept into Hades? Or would you choose to be part of the group that gets ushered into the presence of God? Because the reality is death is coming for all of us, so long as the Lord tarries. But the reality is upon your death, would you choose to be swept into Hades or hell, into that place of confinement where you will be held captive, where you will be held in bondage until you are raised to stand before the great white throne judgment, the judgments of God? Or would you choose to be part of a group that gets ushered into the presence of God immediately upon your death? So you can do that, and the only way to do that is through Christ. There's no other way. You can't do it through Muhammad. You can't do it through Allah. You cannot do it through Buddha. You cannot do it through Mary. You can't do it through the power of positive thinking, and you certainly can't work your way into the good graces of God. It says in the scriptures that that man's best works are counted as filthy rags. That man's works are their wages unto death. But there is a way that God has made. In John 14:6, Jesus said to him, "I am the way." He's the way. He is the truth and the life. And no one comes to the Father except through him. He is the only way. He is the truth, and he is the only passageway that you or I could have to get to the Father, to get to that place where we will be ushered into the presence of God upon our death. In John 6:44, we read, "No one can come to me unless the Father who sent me draws him, and I will raise him up at the last day." So I want to close with this proposal that if these words mean anything to you, if they're somehow resonating inside of you, the very real possibility is they're resonating inside of you because God the Father is drawing you and has given you the ability to see your need for a Savior and to reach out to Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior. And you can do that right where you are sitting today, tonight, whatever part of the world you may be in. You can just close your eyes and pray and ask God to forgive you of your sins, and that you recognize, you accept, and you embrace Jesus Christ as your Redeemer, that God has raised him from the dead, and that he is your prophet, priest, and king. With that said, I'm going to close this session out, and we'll come back and finish off the fifth, sixth, and seventh seal in the next session. Have a nice day.